Hey guys, welcome to another video, Purple Political Talk here. And today we're going to be looking at the 2020 presidential election according to my prediction. And we're going to look at my prediction going through filling in all these states for where do I think they fall right now due to polling data, due to other information we do have at this time. And we're going to go through and predict who's going to win the 2020 presidential election. Before we do so, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. So let's get started. So we will begin by looking at the safe states for the Democratic Party. So I think at this time, the Democrats have an advantage when it comes to their safe states, as per common knowledge, they are safe. Unlike the Republican Party, who is having they're having a little bit of a struggle, or they had a little bit of a struggle holding on to their states by a safe margin. However, I think due to some of the recent events in U.S. politics, like some of the riots that are happening nationwide in some of America's largest cities, and crime going up in New York, the Democrats might be in for a little bit of losing support in a lot of their safe states, and the Republicans might be gaining back that support they lost in their safe states. However, I feel like the Republicans are still behind when it comes to safe states. So the starting off map for the Democrats is 190 electoral votes. I think are going to be by a safe margin, more than 15% for them. So we can see that the Northeast pretty safe for them, the West pretty safe for them, and then Illinois, which is one of the safest states for them, and then you have New Mexico, which is it's a tough call there. I would say it's safe due to recent electoral history and the way the election is going. Donald Trump could easily contest this state, but right now, not the most, likely scenario for this race. So now that we're done with the Democratic safe states, let's look at the Republican safe states where I believe the Republican Party and the president will win by over 15%. So these are going to be your regular safe states for the Republicans that have been longtime Republican safe states: Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska's at large first and third district, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, or actually not South Carolina, but definitely Mississippi and Alabama, as well as Kentucky, West Virginia, and I think at this point in the state of Indiana, we will see safe margins for the president, where I believe he will win over 15% in these states for him to go through and win these seats and win all these electoral votes. And keep in mind, this is a very small amount compared to what he usually has and what the Republican Party usually has. The thing is that this election is coming down to a little bit more of the Republicans losing some support nationwide. So that's what we're seeing a lot of less red than usual for the starting off maps. So the Republicans begin with 103 electoral votes, and the Democrats have 190. Again, with the Republicans, you can notice some red states that are usually red are missing from the safe column. However, I will talk about that later in the video. So now we talked about the Republican safe states. Let's now talk about the likely Democratic states, where I believe Joe Biden and his team could win by around anywhere from 5 to 15%. So there's a couple of these states. I would say the number of these states have diminished, though. I would say states like Nevada at this point are likely for Joe Biden, Colorado likely for Joe Biden again, Virginia likely for Joe Biden, and the state of New Hampshire, I think at this point, likely for Joe Biden. Everything else is going to be somewhat more contested, and I think that these states are in the likely column for a reason. In the state of Nevada, you have a lot of Latino minorities who tend to vote Democrat. The Latino community nationwide is very diverse. Some lean GOP, some tilt Democrat, others are straight down the middle. Nevada is a state where they tilt lean. Even though by likely the Latino vote is expected to go to the Democrats, the number of Latino voters is expected to go up during this election. And another thing that's expected during this election is very high turnout amongst suburban areas. And Nevada is kind of one big city, Las Vegas. Everything kind of runs around that in that state. And the economy was very hard hit there, with tourism kind of down for 3 months, especially through spring break, which was a very hard hit for those companies in the state of Nevada. So I think at this point, looking at what how the Biden team can go through and win here, I think it's going to be easier considering the economic damage and all of that. The president has started to do certain things, but I think Nevada is still going to go to Joe Biden. While in Colorado, it's more of the liberal city, I would say, and there's a lot of liberal support. Now, what could change the thing here if the Bernie bros don't go out and vote for Biden, which will be catastrophic for the Democratic Party. And I think, honestly, at this point in time, there's many things that could happen. I would also say that the suburban vote is really going to be make or break here. If the Democrats are able to carry the suburbs like they have in the last couple of years, they should win here by 7 to 8 points. But I think if they start losing that support in the suburbs, that's really going to hurt them. And I mean, it's not completely out of picture the Democrats lose support in suburbs due to the riots, which really have been affecting them in certain areas of the country. And that's why we've seen a lot of these data go down for the Democrats nationwide. And the state of Virginia is another state that I feel like is a state that realistically, it's a lot about those suburbs. Virginia is mostly made up of suburbs. You have the Richmond suburbs in the middle of the state. You have the Virginia Beach and its suburbs, southern part of the state, and then the southern DC suburbs, also part of the state of Virginia. So there's a lot of suburbs. Now the issue comes here that if the Democratic Party is able to still appeal to these voters, which I think they are, they should be able to win here again by 6 to 7 points, increase their margin of victory from 2016. Now I think honestly, again, what could really hurt them here? It's going to be those riots and those nationwide protesting and all of that. If it gets to an extreme where everywhere it's happening, like maybe how it was in June, some of these states with a lot of suburbs could start flipping. So that's something to look at. And the state of New Hampshire, I would compare it a lot to the state of Virginia just because of how it's very, very suburban, although it's not suburban at all. So the ideals in New Hampshire are very suburban and they're very moderate. And since they're not affected by a lot of the things, for example, that maybe some people in the Sun Belt are that Trump has taken care of, I think those voters in New Hampshire will vote for Joe Biden by around a margin of 5%, which is a substantial margin considering how it was in 2016. So I think the state of New Hampshire is going to go to Joe Biden. So those are all the states right now that I think will go to the Democrats by a likely margin. Now let's go on to the states that I think are going to go to the Republican Party by a likely margin. So I feel like there's a couple of these states, and those include states like Missouri, states like South Carolina. And I also think that at this point, Maine's 2nd congressional district is likely for the Donald Trump campaign. And I think those are the only couple. And the state of Alaska, I forgot that one, for the likely column. And I think this race is going to come down to a lot of closer races. So that's why you're not seeing as big of an amount of likely races as we're seeing usually in past elections. So going through these Republican states, one big trend we're seeing is that a lot of these states, they're solid Republican states in the past, but due to minority turnout and due to other factors, they're being a lot closer than they were in 2016 or even in the past. So looking at this, the state of Alaska, for example, is a state where there are a lot of third-party support. Realistically, in Alaska, it's pretty much a lot of third-party support, which again is very anti-Trump at this moment in the state of Alaska, considering that also a lot of the Republicans are liberal Republicans in the state of Alaska, which is going to be an interesting dynamic to watch. And just looking at it, I think like honestly, Biden's probably not going to be able to win here. The chances are very low. However, he's going to be able to bring those margins closer and be able to go through and get the race a lot closer than it usually is. And if all of third-party vote or a big chunk of it goes to Joe Biden, because again, we're not in 2016 where the third-party vote was a huge thing and it really affected both sides of the aisle. I mean, I think Alaska could maybe a lot closer, and I think honestly, it could go by around 8% for the president. Next is the state of Missouri. This is an interesting state because usually it doesn't get talked about that much closer to election day because it's one of those swing states that becomes a little bit swingy during the middle part of the election. We saw this in 2016. We saw it in 2012. In 2008, it actually was one of the closest states. So in the state of Missouri, why is it close? Well, essentially, it's because there's a lot of African American support amongst areas like St. Louis or Kansas City, which there is a substantial amount of minorities in those areas. And you also have a lot of moderate Republicans in the suburbs to those big major cities. But then you have a lot of rural support in the middle part of the state where there's barely any bigger cities. So right now, I think the president's going to be able to carry this by 10 to 15%. I think like honestly, it's going to come down to Biden going through and lowering the margins of victory in the state of Missouri from the president's expected margins. However, I think like, honestly, it realistically is going to come down how big the minorities turn out because Donald Trump already has his base. And then, yeah, of course, he's going to lose some of the voters that always flip from side to side. But realistically, in Missouri, what's going to like say and define how much support Biden gets, it's definitely going to be how far the minorities turn out. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch for the future. And yeah, so going on to the state of South Carolina, again, another Republican state with a lot of Republican DNA, which realistically is a state where Republicans have won in the past by larger margins. It has had some narrow races, especially in governor races when Nikki Haley ran, but that's more like state by state politics. However, at a nationwide level, the politics in South Carolina are always going to be Republican, at least for the next couple of years. Again, things are fastly changing. For example, Texas, which we're going to get into later on in the video. However, I mean, South Carolina is a state that fastly has been trending Democratic. Is it going to be fast enough to flip it? No. Right now, I think the president still wins here by around 9 to 15%. But since Joe Biden is able to somewhat appeal to African-American support, which, I mean, a lot of that is kind of going a little bit out the window in some ways because there is increasing support amongst African-Americans for the president. I would say that, honestly, Joe Biden can narrow down the margin here, get it to about 10%. But Donald Trump still wins here because of the rural support and the DNA from the Republican Party that's always going to be there. So that's my stance on the state of South Carolina, where I think it falls right now. Lastly, we have a main second congressional district. So this is a little bit of a bold call, I would say. And I call it by a likely margin for the president by 5%. I say it would be like this because, one, this district hasn't been as affected by COVID-19. Of course, they're going to have their effects. Even if you weren't that affected, nationwide, everyone's affected. However, since that didn't affect them much, and it's truly a conservative district, and they're probably going to elect a Republican for House, I would say that, honestly, for the president winning here, is not completely out of the blue, especially by like a margin. So that's what I think of that district. So now that we talked about the likely states for the Republican Party, we can now move on to the lean states for the Democrats. Here is where there's a big chunk of electoral votes for the Democrats and what I think might put them over the edge. So I think right at this point in time, states like Minnesota are lean for the Democrats. Michigan, lean for the Democrats. Pennsylvania, lean for the Democrats. States like Arizona at this point, lean for the Democrats. So these states are states that honestly are somewhat surprising to see in this column because before they were in the likely column because they were going by 7, 8% in some polling data. We have a lot of support for Biden up there. But what's going on? The polling numbers are going down for Biden in the Rust Belt, which is very bad for him because if he loses the Rust Belt, he kind of loses the election unless he's able to go win somewhere else. I would say, like, honestly, one of the big effects we're seeing in the Rust Belt, it's because of the Kenosha riots, especially in Wisconsin, and that race has narrowed down, I would say, somewhat a lot. However, in the other surrounding states, I would say the effect is going to be felt still because it's part of the Rust Belt. In Minnesota, we have the initial Black Lives Matter movement. It kind of started there. And I think, like, honestly, there's still going to be a lot of vote against Trump. But he does have his supporters amongst conservative Republicans that live on the western part of the state, as well as some of the suburban voters, which are flipping. So that state, I think, is going to go by 3 to 5% to Joe Biden. While in Michigan is a state which has started to narrow down a lot, we're seeing a lot of the working class voters going through and flipping, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for Trump in Michigan. Again, voter enthusiasm doesn't mean you're going to win. However, your chances definitely go up. And I think the Rust Belt coming up is going to be one of the more contested areas. And I think before Donald Trump, he had given up on Michigan. He could definitely go back because it's the closest Rust Belt state by polling numbers. Well, the state of Pennsylvania is another state which it really matters, especially on the western part of the state, where you look at the more factories that were there and just essentially the white working class, so the Rust Belt area, which essentially is West Pennsylvania. That area of the state is it's really down the fence right now. A lot of them are thinking of voting for Trump. A lot of them are thinking for voting for Biden. However, there's really no way to tell at the end of the day until those voters go into the polls and cast their ballot for whoever they want to be president of the United States. So the Rust Belt is currently an area, like I said, very interesting because Biden was leading by substantial margins. Those margins have since gone down. And we could see this race be very, very close, a lot closer than a lot of people have expected. So last in the lean column for the Democrats is the state of Arizona. This is a state where realistically the Democrats have a nice chance of victory. A lot of people put this state a little bit further into the Democratic column than I think it actually is. The state, I would say, only goes by 2% to the Democratic Party. There is still solid Republican support. And I guess they like moderates there. But, I mean, there's also a very big movement on the southern part of the state with border security. And it's these people, especially in Yuma County in Arizona, that's one of the most famous counties for border security. They're the ones that are being affected by some of these border policies. Not saying they're good or bad, but they're being affected. So a lot of these voters are flipping towards Trump. And for example, in Yuma County in 2016, we saw Hillary Clinton only lose by a couple points. When Marjorie McSally ran, she won the county by a larger margin. So the Republicans are outperforming there. Which again, if you lose Phoenix by a larger margin, that's not going to be Maricopa County. That's not going to be good for them. However, if they're able to substitute those votes with some votes down from Yuma County, they should be fine. So those are all the lean states for the Democratic Party at this time. Now let's go on to the lean Republican states where I think the Republican Party will win it from anywhere from 1.5% to 5%. So I think the states like Texas at this time are lean for the Republican Party. Georgia, I think, are lean for the Republican Party. Ohio are lean for the Republican Party. Iowa are lean for the Republican Party, as well as Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, I think, are lean for the Republican Party at this time. So in Texas is a state where I think a lot of people have been overestimating Biden in some ways. Yes, he's going to get close, and it's going to be one of the closest results we've had in Texas in a long time. However, here's the thing. I think we have to notice that there is still the Republican base in Texas that will go out and vote for the president. And I think, honestly, that base is going to be somewhat higher. And, of course, in a best-case scenario, we could definitely see Biden flip it. Here's why I'm a little bit skeptical. The 2018 Senate race, Beto O'Rourke got close. Again, it was a midterm year, so that's not a good comparison because we're talking presidential years, a lot bigger numbers. However, I mean, looking at the race, Beto O'Rourke was a charismatic candidate that could appeal to the rural voters, that could appeal to the urban voters, that could appeal to the suburban voters. I don't think Joe Biden's that candidate. So I think he could definitely get close within maybe 5%. However, I don't think it's going to be him. I don't think it's going to be him winning or him narrowing down to the point where it's going to be a nail biter for the Republican Party. I think that Donald Trump will be able to carry it by around 3 points. Same thing in the state of Georgia. It's a state where there is a lot more, I would say, potential for a Biden flip. There's a lot of African-American support and a lot of increasing Democratic support amongst Atlanta suburbs. I think, honestly, it's going to be interesting to see. I think that there is support for the Democrats there. But I think it's still very Republican DNA that's probably going to go out and vote for the president. I think he's going to win there by 3 points. Well, in Ohio and Iowa, these are two states where I would say that for the most part, these states have been states, again, with Republican DNA. That's one of the things we're seeing during this election. These states that were safe before, likely before, they're coming a lot closer, lean before, and they might be even flipping for the Democrats. Ohio and Iowa, these are two states that when they do flip for the Democrats, one thing that we do notice, it's because it's a very inspiring, a very moving candidate. And I would say that Joe Biden is not that person to flip those states. In polling data, Trump is leading, and in other aspects of like betting markets and support on the ground, we see Trump leading by substantial margin. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But again, like I mentioned, these two states take a very strong candidate to flip because they're Republican states that become swing states when there is a good candidate. For example, Barack Obama was a very moving, very inspiring candidate, and he won by a substantial margin for Democrats. Hillary Clinton lost both of those seats by 5%. Why? Because she wasn't as inspiring, and they're going to go turn to the Republican Party. So, and the best thing is the state of Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. I think that this is a district that is very conservative. They go out for progressives, which is pretty interesting. However, I don't think they're going to go out for Biden. Some of them might be fed up with Donald Trump. However, I think that Donald Trump might be able to win there still. So those are all the districts right now that I think, and states that I think are in the lean column for the Republican Party. And now let's go to the tilt states. The final states I will cover during this election prediction. Right now, I think that there's 3 tilt states: Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida. I think right now the state of Wisconsin is tilting towards the Democrats, while Florida and North Carolina at this point, I say, are tilting towards the Republican Party. So this map is starting to favor a little bit more Donald Trump because we're seeing him gaining momentum, and we're starting to see him gain in the polls. And these states are becoming a lot closer. I think at this point in time, the lead that Biden had mid-July, mid-June, that's completely going out the window right now. We're starting to see the more contested race. Right now, Wisconsin is in a little bit of a state of, I guess, disagreements. I guess there are big riots there. There's a lot of destruction there, which I guess a lot of the suburban voters will take into account when they cast their ballots. I think that Joe Biden is still probably going to narrowly edge it out, maybe by 1%. However, I think that the race is going to be a lot closer than it has been over the last couple of days. Well, the state of North Carolina and Florida, I think, are 2 states that are voting very similar. North Carolina is a state where they have a lot of conservative bases. The base in North Carolina is conservative. And here's the thing. The Democrats do have their supporters in North Carolina, but it's getting them out. If they drive those supporters out, they can probably win the state. Now, there's 2 concerns I have with the Democrats in North Carolina. One, African-American support for the Democrat. Not like it's dived or anything, but it's definitely starting to go down just a little smidget, which, again, it's not good for them because one less voter they could get is kind of just giving another vote to the other person. So I think that's going to hurt them a lot. In addition, I would say that this state is Republican DNA. That's another thing we've been talking about today, a big common theme. This election is going to be kind of a states that have voted solidly Republican narrowing down because Donald Trump is somewhat unpopular nationwide. So North Carolina, I think, is one of those states that's going to narrowly hold on, I would say, by 1%. Well, it's the state of Florida, very interesting here. I think, honestly, Donald Trump's going to win here. And I don't believe the polls here that Biden's winning by 6%, 5%, 4%. And to be honest with you, Florida is a state that's very, very hard to analyze. Past elections, I mean, the state of Florida has been one of the states that's been kind of a little bit closest to being outside the margin of error. And I think it's looking at it in many different ways. It's a hard state to analyze. Right now, the blue counties are having a lot of red support. And we're also seeing, we're seeing some support from the Republicans shifting to the Democrats in the I-4 belt. However, I think at this point in time, we're seeing a lot of red support increase in the state. And I think voter enthusiasm will also do it a little bit for President Trump here. And I think that's it. I mean, at this point in time, this election is going to be very interesting to watch. And a lot of these states are a lot closer than people think. And I think at this point in time, anything could happen. And this is my election prediction for the 2020 presidential elections as of August 30th, 2020. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please give it a huge thumbs up, like, subscribe, turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. Hope you enjoyed the video, and goodbye.